So a couple of years ago, I presented on community resilience and the concept of other. And unfortunately today it's germane again. So I'm the chair of psychiatry for the University of North Dakota School of Medicine and Health Sciences, just down the road. We send you our water. We're going to be doing it again. We will be having some flooding. The other thing that I'd mentioned, I recall when I was here before, was a Britney Spears quote, and she's in the news again because she's going to be having a musical coming out. And her quote was, I love getting to travel to overseas places like Canada. So do I. If people want to interrupt, feel free, but after my presentation, then I will join Shahina and she can continue. When Shahina and I started talking about this, she said, bring your notes and we'll just kind of, gather together. So, and maybe I'll sit down here. So I just wanted to touch on a few things. The other thing that I found in presenting to communities is that, so for instance, when we had our flood crisis, actually a number of times, I was actually invited to the table with the mayor and some of the government, and we would kind of do some processing. But what I found was every day, even though I might have a prepared message, it changed. Just like today. I was emailing Shahina these slides, we were talking for weeks and months, and then this morning woke up to the news. I want to touch on some areas, but also certainly have the opportunity for Shahina to be talking, and also to have some conversation with you all as well. So the other downside is I didn't have the advantage of hearing some of the other speakers, and I really wish that I would have for two reasons. One, I really wanted to learn more, and two, I didn't want to be redundant in maybe what they were saying, so forgive me if that actually happens. So one of the things that we want to talk about is the impact of hate, the impact of prejudice, not only on the individual but on the community. And community can be very broad or very narrow. So some of the data is that for someone who is targeted, they can experience decreased self-esteem. They can actually experience depressive symptoms, anxiety, anger, and there are some people that can actually have post-traumatic stress disorder, where people are avoidant of things or very excessively vigilant, excessive recall. For the chapter that I wrote in that book, I worked a lot with our resident doctors, many of whom are Muslim. And we talked about what it's like, and one of them said, when there are attacks in the news like today, I don't want to go to mosque. I want to avoid it. And so we process that, and how do we as individuals deal with this, and how do we deal with it as a community? The downside is perpetrators sometimes feel emboldened by prejudice, discrimination, stereotyping, etc. And we also know that this starts very early for many people. A couple of years ago, again, I had a slide on that had two children, and they were the kids. One was black and one was white. And the African-American child wanted to cut his hair so the teacher couldn't tell them apart. And so it was just precious. But there was a famous song by Rodgers and Hammerstein, "You've got to be carefully taught to hate and fear day after day, year after year." So kids grow up in this way, and bullies oftentimes may act not initially from hate, but from anger, fear, and ignorance. And I don't know, Omar, did you talk at all about adverse childhood experiences, or did anyone else? Have people heard about ACEs? So adverse childhood experiences are things, they can be physical, they can be sexual, they can be emotional abuse. And when children have these experiences, the more they have, the more likely they are to suffer both physical and emotional concerns. It actually has a huge impact on healthcare nationally. And so, one of the things that we want to look at is how do we go to the root? How do we decrease the likelihood of children suffering, becoming bullies, becoming victims, etc.? So there's the individual trauma that children experience, and then there's also vicarious trauma, and I'm sure with the refugees, and every time you are all hearing about trauma, like today, that has an impact on you. We know that people who experience or listen to or see repetition of trauma can actually have post-traumatic stress disorder. They can develop what we call vicarious trauma. Those of you who care for others, which is everyone in this room, can also experience that as well. So one of the things that I would ask you is how do you manage your own stress? You know, for many of you, you deal with people day in, day out in terms of those stresses. There's also a community risk factor that comes into play that impacts children and their adverse childhood experiences, and that's community violence. And that isn't actually showing up here, so I'm not sure. Oh, my gosh. Yeah. Let's see. Let me move this back. This is where I usually have to ask a teenager to come up and to take over things here, so let me... Okay, yeah, so community violence. So when there is violence within the community, that has an impact on our children, that has an impact on our families, obviously, and just not the news itself. So, prejudice. So prejudice doesn't always end up in violence, and we'll see if this actually works here. But when it does, it's termed a hate crime, which is what we were talking about earlier today. And this is actually a Canadian slide from a work group. So there's been discussion of who is it that perpetrates these crimes. And some of those who've done studying, McDevitt, Levin, and Bennett, in particular McDevitt, have looked at 4 different categories. And this is just generalizing. This doesn't cover everybody, but there are those, particularly younger people or people in gangs, et cetera, that's thrill. You know, they do hate crimes for thrill. There are defensive offenders, which also goes to gangs and others, where you're messing on my turf, and so therefore I'm going to attack you. There's unfortunately the mission offenders, which is probably what we're hearing about from New Zealand. We need to rid the world. It's my mission to make sure that the world is a better place by, nihilism. So whether or not it's the Holocaust, whether or not it's these violent episodes that we're experiencing now, those are probably the most dangerous and the ones that certainly bring about the most news. And then retaliatory offenders, essentially bringing justice, taking the long arm of the law into their own hands. So what I always worry about, and probably Omar, those of us in psychiatry, we see both the individual reactions and community reactions. So one of the most protective things that a community and an individual can do when they're faced with a stressor is social engagement, which is what we're doing right here. Isolation is a very concerning reaction. Now, all of us, when something happens, we might want to just go to sleep early or take a day off or whatever, but it's that constant isolation. Like I said of my resident psychiatrist, I'm not going to go to the mosque anymore. I'm not going to do this because I don't want to have to face it, or I don't want to have to be potentially harmed. And then there's also another term that's used within psychology, psychiatry, called learned helplessness. If this happens over and over, do we have the wherewithal to continue to fight, to continue to stand up, to continue to engage? Or do we just say, this just isn't worth it anymore, I don't have the wherewithal to do this? This actually came out of an experiment that was done on dogs, where they shocked a dog, he jumped over the fence to the other side, then they shocked him again. He jumped back, shocked, and figured out, oh, this is no use, I'm just gonna lay down and give up. So that's the concern that we have upon communities and individuals when there are stressors like this, is that people just, it's too much. So there was an interesting study at the University of Sussex, and they looked specifically in Muslim and LGBT participants, and 4 out of those 5 individuals that they queried knew someone who had been victimized. And it disappeared again. There. So common responses were feeling vulnerable. So just even hearing about this, anger, anxiety, avoidance. and a less positive attitude towards authorities. So when Lori was talking about, when she and Krishna were up here, talking about the importance for leadership to be hearing people and to be aware and to be acting, that's particularly important because what happens is naturally there becomes less of a positive attitude towards authorities, and then that can be a vicious cycle. So hate crimes tend to increase also during community tension. So interestingly, when we look at history and periods of particular tension in countries and communities, oftentimes hate crimes go up. Oftentimes there are changes in laws pertaining to immigration more negatively. And certainly that happens. But one of the interesting things is where there is a power balance, when a perpetrator thinks they can't win, that reduces the likelihood of hate crime. So when I read Reinhold Niebuhr lately, and I think it was Moral Man in an Immoral Society, and what struck me was his discussion of the importance of balancing power, and the term he used was actually coercion, and not in a negative way, but politically and in other ways. Simply educating, simply talking about our feelings, simply doing this and that, oftentimes doesn't change things. It may take decades and decades, but leveraged coercion, where there are boycotts, there are votes against legislators, there are campaigns, there's action, not violence to violence, but action, and not learned helplessness, actually has a significant impact. So I mentioned that perpetrators often feel emboldened, but communities do as well. You all here today, while we're struggling, you still feel actually, what can we do? We want to do something, and we oftentimes see that. So how do small communities, so the data was 1% of Canadians are Jewish, 3% are Muslim, 4% of the population. That's a small community. So let me ask you, how do you enhance your power? That's not a rhetorical question. You don't all have microphones, but I'm just curious. As we're talking about this issue, what sorts of things do you think of when we're problem solving?
Holding conferences like this one.
Okay, so holding conferences like this one. When I was driving up here today, and I couldn't drive up last night because the roads were closed, but as I was driving up, I listened to lots of Canadian stations, and it was national. They were talking about this conference, actually. So yeah, that's very important. Other thoughts? Omar, you look like you were going to say something, but.
I mean, we cheated. I used your acronym facts.
Oh yeah, yeah. So part of it is, and the facts, and I'm actually going to use that again. But feel free. Actually, it's for stealing. It's all good. But what we want to think of is not just being reactive, which oftentimes when we look at the science of resilience, it's usually bouncing back, it's reactive to something. What we want to be doing, though, is reduce our need to be resilient, to build that in place. And so one of the things that I thought of, and I put in my chapter, was the last conference we were at. You had not only individuals of Muslim faith, Jewish, Indigenous people, LGBT. One doesn't usually think of those groups as being together, but that's one of the ways that you can enhance power, is small groups coming together with a similar cause, and all of a sudden, we're not talking 1%, we're not talking 3%, we're talking, getting into the majority. So here's another question for you. If this comes up, so what's it like when you hear someone say something hateful to another? What's your usual response?
You try and disagree without, well, it depends on how obnoxious they are.
Yeah, okay. So depending on, what the effort's going to bring, is it going to be worse for you or not? But
Well, not that, like, if my response is the person is really hateful, then they get less sympathy from me, they get less of a respectful.
okay, yep,
If somebody is, if it's milder, they might be more facts.
right,
Education.
okay.
That's what I meant.
Got it. Others? You're, no, I'm good. What do other people think? De-escalate. Have you been trained in de-escalation, or does it come naturally, or?
What she said makes perfect sense. It's
Yep.
just, you were talking about a lot of these issues coming from a point of ignorance, and
Right,
I think that if you, for a lot of the time, through my experience at least, if you calmly explain to people why they're wrong
right.
in a way that's concise,
Mm-hmm.
then usually that de-escalates the situation. Sometimes that's not possible.
Right,
Too often it isn't possible.
yeah.
But
And it sounds like you read your audience. Is this likely to be helpful by challenging? What's the outcome going to be? Or is this, totally a waste of time, or is it actually going to inflame things?
And connected to that, sometimes it's helpful to name things. So to say, that is a stereotype.
Right.
We don't, promote the stereotype.
Right, right. And as we learned, when we were younger, owning that, like you said, so we or I am uncomfortable with this, et cetera. And sometimes it's just important enough for me to say that for my own edification. Sometimes it's because I want to try to see if I can change. But it is very difficult. I teach medical students and residents. I'm sure Omar does as well. And some of it is helping them to learn to challenge their superiors. So when they hear discriminatory comments, that they actually say something. And there's a risk there, particularly to them because of the power differential, but there's a risk to all of us. So you have to decide, at what point am I going to do that? Can you hit that again, Lori? Thanks. Oh, well, maybe they want. Yeah, I was getting messages that my slides were probably going to be corrupted, so I don't know. That's not a good. Yeah. So that was the other thing I brought up. So how do you care for yourself when caring for others who've been traumatized, or when you know it's risky for you? It's a brave thing to step forward, but it comes with risks. So what I want to talk about here, the last couple of slides, is just kind of taking care of ourselves. So go ahead. So what helps victims? So interestingly, when they've queried people who have been traumatized, particularly with hate crimes, these are some of the things that they mention: feeling heard by law enforcement, government, the community, perpetrators. So like Laura was talking about, our leaders, we want to know that they hear what we are saying. And I think in general, when we're talking with other people that we disagree with, most of the time, people simply want to be heard. They don't want to be shouted at. They want to be acknowledged. They don't necessarily want to be, agreed with, but that helps. But people look at things, and if things are fair, and if they have been heard and have a voice, they're much more likely to understand and not overreact than if they're not feeling heard, et cetera. So resilience. So this is what Omar was talking about. So this is a very simple acronym: fostering hope, acting with purpose, connecting with others, taking care of yourself, searching for meaning. What does this mean for me? What does this mean for my community? But the connecting with others, when they've looked at communities in particular that have had significant crises, the two variables that are probably most controllable, or the variable that's probably most controllable, is the engagement, being able to engage with others. Having adequate resources to deal with the problem is also very powerful, but not as much in our control as the social engagement is. And then I like this slide I just happened to see. It also had the proper spelling for humor, the Canadian spelling for humor, so I thought I'd throw that in there. But there are many similar things here. There's attitude, awareness, there's social support, self-belief, ability to problem solve. But it's kind of the opposite of what I mentioned with that learned helplessness. So building that resilience, continuing the social engagement, making sure that when things happen, that we're engaged and in a position to be able to respond is important, okay? So, this was in my last talk, and what we find is that that strong communities have similar traits, and one of them is strong leadership. And the ability to engage their citizens. And remember I mentioned communities can be very small or very large. So your leadership, like Shahina Siddiqui, engage citizens like yourself. Wise use of resources. You all were looking at the posters, how do we educate other people, etc., and attending to psychosocial needs. That's Fran Norris's work, okay? I just kind of like this slide. You know, we all, my wife is a master gardener, and she's very interested in plants and trees, etc. And I'm constantly amazed at how black a thumb I have and how green a thumb she has. But there are things that she can do, even in challenging areas, that allows for continued growth. So that is all I have, and I'm going to turn it over to Shahina, and we can visit afterwards, I'm sure.
Mine is very practical. I did this in our conference in Montreal in 2002 after 9/11 and made some predictions, and may Allah forgive me, they have come true. Because I said that day, you guys think this backlash is bad, wait for what is coming. So you can continue. Very practical, and Andy has already covered some, so I'm not going to dwell on it. The definition of backlash is sudden and adverse reaction, okay? To me, what is happening now, this is a very mild definition, because we are all can understand, oh, something bad happened, 9/11 happened, and we all reacted, right? But that is more than that. So now combine ignorance, negative stereotype, misinformation, propaganda, and politics, steer it with anger, fear, and alienation, and hate is born. Because I hear this so much. Why do you say Islamophobia, right? 103, we wanted to recognize it in the assembly. Everybody went crazy. Oh, there is no Islamophobia, it's just Muslim hate. No, hate against. Why not call an ace an ace? We are not born to hate. Okay, God did not create us to hate. We make hate, we promote hate. And the process of hate is that you have to create fear. You will not hate me if you know me. But if you don't know me and I make you afraid of me, and you're made afraid of me, then there is hate. So hate is born through the process. So and that is why it is essential to call it Islamophobia. Okay, that's fine. The dictionary, you know, we use this word hate. What does it really mean? What is the definition of it? It is to dislike strongly, bear malice towards, an active ill will, all based on verbs. Do you see that? If I hate someone in my heart, nothing. But if we act out, we have hate crimes. And leads to adverse reactions. Hate, you have, now if you combine all that, you have a recipe for backlash, sudden and adverse. So when one is recipient of hate, suddenly and without warning, attack is hurried, not rationally thought out, reaction is at worst, and lines can be drawn, fences are built up, and us and them. So this is what happened after 9/11 with the backlash, okay? We are taking you through a process to now. This is also a prime environment for producing conspiracies and paranoia, and that is what was done to us through the media. We all became paranoid about Muslims and about Islam. So what was the reaction? Among Muslims in Canada, counselors have noticed and documented the following impact, for which some victims have sought help and others to this day have not sought help. New immigrants afraid of losing their status, they didn't want. You know, in 9/11, how many Muslims died? Close to 300. And how many went undocumented because they didn't have the green card, they were Bangladeshis and others working. I had mothers calling me from the States and saying, can you please find out if my child is okay? Is he not? Can we do a funeral? Hiding because now the family could be sent back. Impact also varies. Okay, we'll continue, that's fine. Also varies in severity depending on age, gender, and socio-economic status. This is interesting. I noticed that. I'll take my time, young girl. Yeah, exactly. Because I need you to process this. Because unless you process it, you can't understand what people go through. Some experience a whole array of symptoms with short-term and serious effects. Most are long-term effects. Fear, this is numbing paralysis of the senses, if you can understand. This is the kind of fear. It's not a fear I can run away from. It's happened. And this morning, I've never broke down. All that I've done over 35 years against hate and racism. This morning when CBC called me at 6 o'clock when I hadn't had time to process, I couldn't, and she kept apologizing. I can't articulate what I am. And that gives you an example of what 48 hours after 9/11, I had done 72 interviews, right? National, international, local, whatever. There would be media people on my back door, my front door, on my email, on my cell phone, on my landline. I was exhausted, right? And I thought, when the first anniversary happened, CBC called me and asked, so Shahina, how do you feel? I said, I'm still on a roller coaster. I haven't caught my breath, and I haven't caught it yet. United States and Canada, National Care USA put my name and another counselor's name on their website for crisis counseling after 9/11. So I was doing that while I was also doing media, right? The husband calls me from Washington and says, my wife is going into premature labor. People, neighborhood are out there screaming and shouting because she wears a hijab. I can't get an ambulance to take her. She did lose the child, okay? So it's totally incapacitating. The entire Muslim community leadership literally froze. So it was 3 or 4 of us who were in front of the media, not only trying to give the right message about Islam, but also trying to protect the community. For 48 hours, I had not eaten. Or by 70, my husband had to call someone from the community, can you come in? My office was in and there were many other colleagues like me going through this. Unable to process what has happened. Denial and detachment are also common responses to fear, okay? Anxiety, as Andrew said, one of the long-term effects of hate recipients is anxiety. We started seeing a rise in anxiety among newcomers and refugees, dreading state of anxiety that may take hold of the person at any time with no obvious trigger. And I experienced it myself. The anxiety of having to look over my shoulder every time I walked into a TV station because somebody could be following me. Somebody, unwilling to leave the house or to be in public places. When women started calling me and saying they are not gone for grocery, they're afraid to step out because they were accosting Muslim women who were wearing the hijab, it's amazing that a Second World War veteran heard me on radio saying that and called me and said, Shahina, I will go with those women. I will go with them to the grocery stores. I've laid my friends laid their lives for freedom. I can't see it going. And that's the kind of support that Andy was talking, that community gives. Isolate, marginalize, since the backlash is usually directed towards minority groups, the feeling of marginalization is reinforced. I am in a minority, but now I'm minority time 2. Victim is not able to identify or relate to the majority because I have been othered, right? Many Canadian-born Muslims have articulated their feeling of not belonging and feeling insecure. They are questioning if this is their home. I was getting calls from students, and I continue after every effect, is this my home? Where do I go? My son has nowhere to go. He was born and raised my grandkids. I can say, yeah, I'm going back, but where? Isolated. This marginalization from society tends to foster a sense of isolation. All that was familiar is now seen as a threat. Imagine a child feeling unsafe in their school, in their neighborhood. I can't play hockey on the street because if they know I'm Muslim. School is no longer my school. Then when this translates into a community response as well, can be very unhealthy. So why me and my colleagues were out in the open doing what we were doing is we didn't want, as you said, the community to isolate itself, because that's the first human response to fear. Next, defensive. This is very interesting. I saw this within the Muslim community, but it happens in others. As a consequence, from backlash and subsequent, Muslims find themselves in a constant defensive state. I always have to say, Islam is not terrorism. Terrorism is, rather than saying what Islam is. Literally within 2 months, because I was doing maybe 3 or 4 talks a day, in 1 year I had done over 2 years, 1,000 talks. I kid you not. And I was much younger, and my husband said, "Do you realize you're stooping?" I was walking like this because of the burden here. It had a physical impact. We perceive that we are under attack, therefore always in a tiresome defensive posture. That's not a healthy thing for our youth to be in. Proactive work of community outreach is so important when such crisis happens, as Andy was saying. Some have responded by clamming up. Communities didn't want to talk. They didn't want to come to the mosque. By shying away from the public eye, and others by withdrawing emotionally, spiritually, and even intellectually. They couldn't question what has the government done, what statements have come out, nothing. When one is constantly called to explain something for which they are not responsible, the message is, the psyche receives, you are guilty. We were guilty without having done anything. Under attack, the fear of being judged and without a fair trial. A trial has taken deep hold of North American Muslims, because we believe that society out there is the judge, jury, and executioner. The constant perceived assault from the media, law enforcement, and government has caused battle fatigue among Muslim activists, leaders, and community. And today I felt that fatigue first time when I couldn't keep my emotions in check. We are tired. And I have been telling the media for the longest time. 1 year before 9/11, there was a full-page coverage of me as being the media watchdog for Muslims. And I said, can you please stop using the term Islamic terrorism? We are going to pay a price for this. And we did. And we continue to. The way Muslim counselors and social workers have described the impact of hate on Muslim psyche is emotional trauma, leading to self-imposed psychological internment. This is what we did to ourselves. Even if one of was not directly targeted, the hate and shared experience traumatized the entire community to feel and experience effects of trauma. Especially the refugees. Do you know what I noticed? While we were getting together with healing circles in the mosque and whatnot, we were not seeing the Bosnians and the Kosovans. They were the newcomers. And I'm going, they need help. Where are they not coming? We went knocking on the door. They had just come from ethnic cleansing. They didn't want to be re-identified as Muslims. So they were denying themselves that help, right? We can keep going. Overcompensation. This is what we did too. The tendency to please your oppressor, abuser, is also a normal reaction when you are traumatized that way. Many Muslims reacted to hate by bending over backwards to please and to comply. I had Muslims on radio and TV saying, yeah, that's, turning on the community rather than because they said this way we will be accepted, because we are speaking the language of the majority. For example, by joining co-workers in making fun of their co-religious by joining them and criticizing the faith and culture. And then when they went home, I got a call, because now the guilt, the fear of what they had done. Dealing with guilt of either going along or keeping quiet. Need to prove. Some react by working overtime to prove that they did not deserve the hate being directed to them. Can you imagine? And I remember one of my professor friends always said, Shahina, there's something wrong with our society when we put the burden of fighting hate on the shoulders of the recipient of hate, right? In some instances, latching on to conspiracy theories, right? In some, becoming belligerent in their defense. We saw the both extremes. Yeah. Assimilate, hide identity, this happened. This happened with the Holocaust survivors. They were moving. They were changing their names so people wouldn't know they were Jewish. And there were men coming, boys coming to us and saying, I want to shave my beard. Girls taking off their hijab because they didn't want to be identified. Insecure, cannot trust. When hate is directed to you from the least expected sources, like neighbors, co-workers, schools, peers, teachers, the effect is devastating, right? The message is that one is not safe anywhere and for anyone, from anyone. This is frightening state to be in, with the ability in serious emotional and psychological breakdowns, and we did. We saw the ride of depression and anxiety among Muslim community, situational, not something that I could have psychologists or psychiatrists put them on medication for. They needed to be built up. When hate is directed at you, yeah, we've done that. This is another thing was interesting when I was counseling people. Many Muslims withdrew and still continue to from the normal social scene. They didn't want to go out with their coworkers. They didn't want to, in some cases physically, and in some by not participating in discussions, just being in the background. They hold the fear that if they express their opinion, they may be labeled misunderstood and taken to task. The tendency to stick to your own became almost pathological. They didn't want to go anywhere but with Muslims in the masjid and whatnot. Many express a feeling of shame, imagine that. Feel responsible, this is enforced with every new hate crime, okay? You did not see the media at churches when the Quebec thing happened. Did they go to the church and say, oh, is this in your religion, Lorraine? What do you say about this terrorist? But every time they are there at the mosque. And last time with my friend John Longest, we had an exchange of emails because with one of the cases in Pakistan, some nutcase had given that, oh, if she goes to Canada, Canadian Muslims should kill her. And he asked me a question. I knew where it was coming from. He just wanted to know as a journalist, but I said, you want me to respond to this crazy nut? I've had it. Right, John? And we had 3 or 4 exchanges with that because you don't, has anybody even today gone to churches in New Zealand? And name of the city is what? Nobody is calling up churches in groups. This is a typical response to an abused, since the abuser is identifying your ethnicity, your race, your religion as the reason or trigger of making them to target you. So even though I'm the victim, I'm now become the reason. Healing is interrupted. This is very important for all of you to know that Muslims had a very hard time healing after every attack is because it's interrupted by making sure everybody is okay in the community, you are okay and all that. You need time to heal. I was talking to Lorraine this morning. I said, right now, what we need to hear is from everyone is that we recognize your pain. All the other things of we stand together, we rally together, will come later. But right now, what the community needs to hear, what my grandchildren need to hear, is you're hurting, and I validate your pain. That's all. And the rest will come. Impact on society, that's very quickly. Promotion of hate is insidious with many faceted effects on holder and the recipient. Our collective humanity diminishes with every new hate crime that is ignored. If you ignore the impact of this hate crime, our humanity will diminish. Our values are compromised and the unspeakable becomes acceptable. All of you who are old enough, Can you ever remember the things that are being said now, the language that is being used by our politicians in our media talk shows, on social media? Was it ever acceptable? It has become acceptable. Like, we can blame Mr. Trump, Andrew didn't, whoever is listening, I did. But this is exploited by groups whose interests may vary from political and social power to religious and racial bigotry and superiority. So you guys all of you are also victims of Islamophobia. How? Because they have triggered in you a dislike, a fear. Even if you don't know it, you have absorbed the media messages. Islamic terrorism, it has become synonymous. We don't any longer say facial tissue, we say Kleenex. Why? Because we branded it, tissues as Kleenex. So we branded terrorism. We never use it for anyone else. We talked about it. Very quick, we've done this. I just wanted to show you something and leave you, next slide. Let's go forward. Okay, these are some of the elements from Berkeley that we have in the infograph, but go further. Language matters. Please, please, please use your language very carefully. Jihadi terrorism, excuse me, jihad is a noble cause in Islam. What are you doing? What are my grandchildren going to say? I'm teaching them jihad is exertion and struggling to be good, to bring good to society, and you are equating it to terrorism. Even Muslims have started using this term now, because we are also being influenced from the, no, we have to make a distinction. Jihad is not terrorism, terrorism is not jihad. Islamic terrorism, I talked about it. Honor killing. Okay, so a Muslim kills, a brown person kills his wife and daughters, it's not murder. It's honor killing. A white man kills him, that's murder. What is the message honor killing is giving you? First, you're telling the victim, if only you were honorable. Second, you are giving a fig leaf of nobility to this perpetrator who in his twisted mind can say, I did an honorable thing. Language matters. Ask yourself why one label for one community and a different label for a different community. There's this, my favorite verse from Longfellow is, live not like dumb driven cattle. Be a soldier in strife, right? But they are leading us like dumb driven cattle. Barbaric cultural practices, yeah, first, the indigenous of this land were barbaric, and now we are barbaric. We just keep continuing the continuation of the same language. We haven't used it for the New Zealand killing. When he shoots a woman pleading for her life, that was not barbaric. Have you heard that on the media, that term? If it was a Muslim, I can guarantee it. Jihadism, excuse me? What the heck is jihadism? We are producing terms that have no meaning. An ism, usually fascism. Do you see the connection? How they are playing with our minds, our cognitive patterns, and Islamicism. This is our Prime Minister, right? Till today I haven't found a meaning for what is Islamicism. So I don't want to take too much of your time, but I really want you to know that these are the 7 stages of neocolonialism Canadian style. Divide them through exploitation of their differences. Shia, Sunni, practicing Muslim, non-practicing Muslims. What is the other one? Conservative and secular, all kinds of terms. And I do entire days on this workshop. Create a desirable class, moderate versus fanatic, fragmenting the community. Get hold of the narrative using all mediums of messaging, propaganda, misinformation, manufacturing lies, and repetitions. There are foundations in North America, millions of dollars, whose job is just to promote fear and hatred of Muslims. Actively. Get hold of the narrative and go after the women. That is what they did to the indigenous. Take the women out of the council, ban council, right? Brought the European idea of men owning the women to the Muslim countries. So what are they doing here? They're going after my this. They're going after my this. I can't be Canadian. I'm un-Canadian because I'm modestly dressed, right? What does it do? Guys, when you go after the mother and the sister and the daughter, what do you do to the family? What effect does it have on the men? See the connection? Next slide. Marginalized and stigmatized culturally, politically, and religiously. Barbaric, honor killing, misogynist. All these labels stigmatize them on all their culture is barbaric. Political, look at them, they don't have any democracy in Islam. Religiously, it's inferior, it's this. Create and nurture fear. So we are defensive. People always say, Muslims are always reacting. When do we have time to be proactive? Right? We are always reacting. Weaken and ignore community-based leadership and promote appointed leaders. You know who our government is listening to? Who our law enforcement is listening to as experts on terrorism? They are Muslim Islamophobes. And I say this without fear. But they speak the language that we want to hear. It's secular. It's against Islam. It's saying women are oppressed and suppressed. So they are the desirables that we want to promote. After 9/11, every time I was speaking, there was this guy, Muslim Islamophobe. Finally, he had it with me, and he termed me as the president of the Women's Auxiliary of the Taliban. Taliban have a women auxiliary. That was news for me first. But because he just couldn't get me to shake, right? But guess what? Who was listening to him? Our prime ministers, our security tables, our conversation, which was in the chambers of power. But they were not coming to the ground, and they did that to the indigenous, right? That's why I say these stratagems are the same. And I'm gonna end that. I'm sorry if I took some more time, but I really needed to do this today. Thanks.
You did.